It was a calm Sunday morning, the kind of morning where the sun rose gently, spilling golden light over the quiet suburban streets. The birds were just starting their songs and the smell of freshly cut grass floated in the air. For most people, it was a perfect day to relax. For Daniel Brooks, it was the start of a new chapter. After 30 years in law enforcement, Daniel had finally decided it was time to retire. His knees weren't what they used to be. His eyes tired a little faster, and the late-night calls that once gave him purpose now only left him restless. He had spent most of his adult life solving crimes, keeping the peace, and watching people at their best and worst. Now he just wanted quiet. He stood in his driveway that morning, hammering a small for sale sign into the ground. The neighborhood had been good to him, safe, quiet, and full of families who waved when they passed. But the house had grown too big, too empty since his wife passed away 2 years earlier. Their daughter had moved to another state, urging him to sell and come closer to her and the grandkids. It sounded nice, he thought. Morning coffee with family, no more long winters, and no more late-night noises echoing through an empty house. He took a step back and looked at the sign. It leaned slightly, so he adjusted it, smiled, and gave a small nod. It felt like the right decision. He went inside, made himself a cup of coffee, and sat by the window to enjoy the peace. That peace didn't last long. Just after lunch, a knock echoed through the house, sharp, impatient, and repeated 3 times before he could even get to the door. Daniel opened it and found a woman standing there, holding a clipboard so tightly it looked like she'd squeezed the life out of it. She was in her late 50s, her hair perfectly set, her lips pressed together in a line of authority. Her name tag said Kay Whitmore, though everyone in the neighborhood knew her by one name, Karen. "Good afternoon," she said, her tone not quite matching the words. "I noticed you put up a for sale sign this morning." Daniel smiled politely. "That's right. I'm planning to move closer to my family." She looked past him, scanning his porch like she was searching for something wrong. "You didn't submit a notice to the HOA. According to Section 4, subsection B, all homeowners must inform the board before making any visible changes to their property, including signage." Daniel blinked. "It's just a sign." "Yes," she said firmly, "but rules are rules. You can't have a for sale sign without prior approval. I'll have to note this as a violation." He raised an eyebrow. "A violation?" "I'm just selling my house." Karen's tone softened slightly, but her eyes didn't. "It's not personal. We just like to maintain a certain look in the community. I'll send you an official notice later today. Have a nice afternoon." She turned on her heel and walked away before he could respond. Daniel stood there watching her disappear down the sidewalk, shaking his head. He'd dealt with all kinds of people in his years as a detective, con artists, liars, and even the occasional troublemaker who thought they were above the law. But something about Karen was different. She carried herself like she owned the entire neighborhood and everyone else was just renting space. That evening, as Daniel sat reading, a white envelope slid under his front door. Inside was a printed letter with the HOA's logo on top. "Notice of violation, unauthorized signage. You are hereby informed that your property at 48 Oakfield Drive is in violation of the community's exterior regulations. Please remove the unapproved for sale sign within 24 hours to avoid fines." Daniel exhaled slowly. He wasn't angry yet, just surprised. He'd always followed the rules, always been respectful of others, but this seemed excessive. He decided to leave the sign up for now. The next morning, Karen was back. He saw her through the blinds, standing in front of his house with her clipboard, snapping photos of the sign. Daniel stepped outside, coffee in hand. "Morning," he said, trying to sound friendly. She didn't look up. "You haven't removed it." "I haven't," he replied evenly. "Because there's no reason to. The HOA can't stop someone from selling their home. I've checked." Karen's expression hardened. "We'll see about that," she said, scribbling something before walking off. By the end of the week, Daniel had received 2 more letters. One claiming his mailbox was 2 inches taller than regulations allowed. Another saying his driveway appeared slightly discolored and might require resurfacing. It would have been almost funny if it wasn't so petty. He started noticing Karen's car parked across the street some evenings. She'd sit there for a few minutes, then drive away. Neighbors started acting cautious around him, some waving less, others avoiding eye contact altogether. He could feel the shift, but Daniel wasn't the kind of man to react without thinking. Years of detective work had taught him patience. Instead of confronting her, He began keeping records, dates, times, photos, even copies of every notice she sent. A week later, when a young couple came by to look at the house, Karen appeared again as if she had been waiting for them. She stopped them right at the driveway. "Excuse me," she said in that same commanding tone. "Are you aware this property is currently under review by the HOA? There have been multiple violations. I'd be careful before considering any purchase." The couple exchanged nervous looks and quickly left. Daniel watched from the window, jaw tightening. That wasn't just petty anymore. That was sabotage. That evening, he decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. He wanted to get a feel for how others saw Karen. He stopped to talk to an older man sitting on his porch, a quiet neighbor named Harold. "She's been running this place like a fiefdom for years," Harold said, shaking his head. "No one stands up to her because she threatens to fine everyone. Last year, she forced the Millers to repaint their house because she didn't like the shade of beige they chose." "Beige? Can you believe that?" Daniel listened, nodding slowly. "She gets away with it because no one checks her," Harold continued. "She runs the HOA meetings, writes the minutes, and files the reports herself. It's her little kingdom. Has anyone ever tried to report her?" Daniel asked. Harold chuckled. "To who? The HOA is her. She's been president for almost 10 years. Daniel thanked him for the talk and walked home, his mind already connecting dots. There was something more going on here, something beyond control issues and petty rules. He'd seen that look before, people who hide behind authority to cover something else. That night he went through his old police notebooks, the ones he kept for reminders and references. He had dealt with dozens of small-time fraud cases in his career, patterns of behavior, repeated tactics, paper trails that always told the real story. And though he didn't have proof yet, his instincts told him Karen's motives weren't just about power. The next morning, Daniel received yet another envelope. This time it was thicker. Inside was a formal letter saying the HOA had temporarily suspended his permission to sell his home until all violations were cleared. It also included an invoice for fines totaling $450. That was the moment Daniel realized this wasn't about neighborhood standards at all. It was extortion disguised as policy. He sat down at his kitchen table, the morning sunlight spilling across the papers. He reread the letter carefully, taking note of every vague phrase, every line that didn't quite sound legal. Then he reached for a small recorder he still kept in his desk drawer, an old habit from his detective days. He clicked it on. HOA violation notice dated June 7th, he said quietly. Signed by K. Whitmore. Suspended property sale without due process. Possible misuse of authority. He smiled faintly to himself. It had been a long time since he'd opened a case file, but the feeling was familiar. The slow burn of curiosity mixed with determination. Over the next few days, Daniel observed more closely. He noticed that Karen's house, larger than most in the neighborhood, had recently undergone renovations. New fencing, a fresh driveway, new garden lights. Yet none of those projects had gone through the approval process she was so strict about. He also noticed a pattern. 3 houses on the block had sold within the past year after receiving similar violation notices. One of those houses had been bought at a surprisingly low price, and then resold months later by a small real estate company with a familiar name, Whitmore Realty. That night, Daniel sat in his living room. Papers spread across the table, eyes focused. He wasn't angry anymore, he was intrigued. Karen wasn't just being difficult. She was running a game, but she didn't know who she was dealing with. The next morning, he saw Karen walking her small dog down the street. She paused near his driveway again, probably checking if the sign was still up. It was. "Good morning, Karen," Daniel called out politely. She glanced at him with a forced smile. "Good morning. I hope you've considered removing that sign." "Oh, I've considered a lot of things," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "But I've decided to leave it right where it is." Karen tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You're making this difficult for yourself." "The HOA takes these matters seriously." "I'm sure it does," Daniel replied. "And I take fraud seriously." She frowned, not quite sure what he meant. "Excuse me?" Daniel just smiled. "Nothing. Just thinking out loud." He went back inside, leaving her standing there with a puzzled look. He didn't plan to confront her yet. Not until he had everything lined up. As the day ended, Daniel sat by the window watching the sunset paint the neighborhood in shades of gold. The houses looked peaceful again, like they always did in the evening, but he knew there was more beneath the surface. He opened his small notebook and began writing, case file, Oakfield. HOA, preliminary notes, multiple fraudulent fines, property interference. Possible real estate profit scheme suspect? K. Whitmore. He tapped the pen thoughtfully. The thing about people like Karen, he thought, was that they always underestimated others. They believed authority made them untouchable. But Daniel Brooks had built a career on seeing through people like that, and whether she knew it or not, she had just opened a case with the wrong man. The next few weeks felt longer than any Daniel could remember. Each morning began with another envelope from the HOA, each one carrying some new violation. First it was the sign, then the height of his hedges, then the color of his shutters. Every time he fixed something, another complaint arrived. At first he tried to brush it off. He told himself it wasn't worth getting angry over. But the pattern was too exact, too constant. It wasn't random. It was targeted. And there was no doubt in his mind who was behind it. One morning, he found Karen standing by his driveway again, this time taking pictures of his trash bins. "Morning," he said. Stepping outside, Karen turned quickly like she hadn't expected him to catch her. "Oh, hello. I was just inspecting waste compliance. Your bins are slightly visible from the street." Daniel looked at her, then at the bins sitting neatly by the curb, exactly where every other house kept theirs. "You mean like everyone else's?" She gave a tight smile. "We try to hold all homeowners to the same standard." "I see," he said slowly. "So just to be clear, you're inspecting everyone's trash bins today?" Karen hesitated, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for an answer. "Eventually," she said. "We rotate inspections." Daniel didn't say anything more. He just smiled politely and went back inside. But the moment he closed the door, he pulled out his small notepad and jotted down the date, time, and what she said. Then he walked to the front window, carefully taking a few photos of her still standing there, looking annoyed. That evening, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open. He'd decided to dig deeper. If Karen was doing this to him, she'd done it to others. He started searching through property records, public HOA filings, and county sale data. It was tedious work, but he'd done it 100 times before in his career. And sure enough, a pattern began to appear. 3 years ago, a man named Peter had tried to sell his house 2 streets over. Within a month of putting it on the market, he received 7 violations and eventually sold the home for nearly 30% below market value. The buyer? A company called Oakfield Holdings, which had the same business address as Whitmore Realty. The same thing happened again the following year, with 2 other houses. Both faced sudden HOA fines, both sold under pressure, and both ended up owned by the same company. Daniel leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. He wasn't surprised anymore, he was focused. It was a setup. A quiet money game disguised as neighborhood rules. He spent the next few days collecting everything: names, addresses, sale prices, even old meeting minutes he could find on the HOA website. He printed them out and organized them neatly into folders. It felt strange being back in investigative mode after so long, but it also felt right. His instincts were alive again. One evening, while he was outside trimming his bushes, his neighbor Linda stopped by. She was friendly but cautious, glancing around before speaking. "I heard you're having trouble with the HOA," she said softly. Daniel wiped his hands on a towel. "Something like that." Linda nodded, lowering her voice. "Be careful. Karen doesn't like being questioned. My sister used to live on Birch Lane. Karen forced her to repaint her house twice in one summer. When she tried to fight it, they fined her every week until she gave up." "Did she ever report it?" Daniel asked. "To who?" "The board's all her friends. They won't go against her." He nodded. "That's what I figured." Linda hesitated, then said, "If anyone can stop her, it's probably you. People talk, you know. They say you used to be a detective or something." Daniel smiled faintly. "Something like that." Linda gave a knowing look before heading off. Her words echoed in his mind as he finished trimming the bushes. He wasn't trying to be anyone's hero, but he also couldn't stand watching someone like Karen abuse power just because no one had pushed back. A few days later, Daniel decided to attend the monthly HOA meeting. He hadn't gone in years, but if he wanted to see how deep this went, it was time. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a neat little building near the park. Inside, about 20 residents sat in folding chairs while Karen stood at the front, surrounded by a few board members who all seemed to agree with her before she even finished speaking. "Let's begin," Karen said, tapping her clipboard. "First, we'll review ongoing violations." She read through a list of names and fines, her voice sharp and confident. When she reached Daniel's name, she paused, almost smiling. "Mr. Brooks, multiple infractions pending resolution. Signage, property maintenance, and trash placement. All still unresolved." Daniel raised a hand. "Actually, about that, could you clarify the exact rule about trash bins? I've checked the handbook and I couldn't find anything saying they can't be visible from the street." Karen's lips tightened. "It's under Community Standards, subsection 7. I have subsection 7 right here," Daniel said, holding up a printed copy. "It says trash bins should be placed curbside only on collection day." "Mine were." Murmurs spread across the room. Karen shifted slightly but didn't back down. "We'll review that wording later. Let's move on." Daniel let it go for now. He wasn't there to argue, he was there to observe. As the meeting went on, he noticed how Karen controlled every topic. When residents raised concerns about rising fees or confusing charges, she dismissed them quickly. When the meeting ended, Daniel lingered outside. A few residents approached him quietly. "She's been doing this for years," one whispered. "No one ever stands up to her." Another said, "My wife and I got fined for having flower pots that didn't match the house color. She threatened to put a lien on our home." Daniel nodded, listening carefully. "Would you be willing to share those letters? The ones she sent you?" They hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, if it helps." That night, Daniel went home with a small pile of envelopes handed to him by those neighbors. He read through each one, finding the same patterns: official-looking forms, vague wording, inflated fines, and Karen's signature at the bottom of every page. He scanned them all into his computer, labeling everything neatly. He wasn't just documenting now. He was building a case, but Karen wasn't slowing down either. The next morning, Daniel found a bright orange sticker on his front door that said, "Final notice, immediate action required," and apparently his grass was uneven. He couldn't help but laugh. The grass looked fine, perfect actually. He knew she was trying to push him into reacting, but that wasn't going to happen. Instead, he decided to pay her a visit. He waited until late afternoon when she was usually home. Her house sat at the corner, with a freshly painted white fence and perfectly arranged flower beds. Daniel walked up and knocked on the door. Karen opened it, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Oh, Mr. Brooks, to what do I owe this visit?" "I wanted to talk," he said simply. "About the violations," her tone sharpened. "Everything is handled according to HOA policy." "I'm sure it is," he said calmly. "I just want to understand how you decide which houses get cited. Seems like some of them never do." Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you suggesting bias?" "I'm suggesting a pattern," Daniel said, his voice even. "And I've got documentation." For a split second, something in her expression changed, something cold and calculating. Then she smiled. "You're welcome to take your concerns to the board. But as I said, everything we do is by the book." "I've read the book," he replied, "and I've noticed a few pages missing." Karen didn't respond. She just stared at him, her smile fading slightly. "Have a nice evening," he said finally, turning to leave. As he walked away, he could feel her eyes on his back. She knew he was serious now, and that worried her. That night, Daniel received an email, anonymous, no name, no subject. It contained only one line and an attachment. The message read, "You're not the first to notice. Be careful." The attachment was a scanned HOA document, an old financial report showing thousands of dollars in maintenance fees with no listed contractors. The report had Karen's signature at the bottom. Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment. Someone inside the HOA wanted her stopped too. He printed the document and added it to his growing file. This was no longer just a nuisance. It was corruption. He started drafting a summary of everything he'd found: dates, people, violations, property transfers, suspicious fees. The next few days, Karen seemed to grow more nervous. She stopped taking her usual evening walks. The letters slowed down. The neighborhood got strangely quiet. It was as if everyone could feel the tension building. Then one afternoon, Daniel got a call from the real estate agent handling his house listing. "Hey," she said carefully, "we've had a few buyers call in, but they all said someone from the HOA told them your house is under investigation. Is that true?" Daniel sighed. No, that's Karen again. She's spreading rumors. Well, it's scaring people off, the agent said. I can't list it properly if the HOA keeps interfering. Daniel thanked her and hung up. For a long time he sat in silence. Then he stood, walked to his office, and opened the folder he'd labeled Case File. It was time to take the next step. He drove to the local county office and requested copies of HOA financial disclosures and property transfer records. It took hours, but he left with everything he needed. When he compared them to what he already had, the full picture became clear. Karen wasn't just abusing her power, she was profiting. Each time a homeowner sold under pressure, the property ended up connected to her relatives or her business. She'd been manipulating the HOA for years. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the wall. The evidence was all there. The question now was how to use it. He decided not to go straight to the police yet. He wanted to be absolutely certain, no holes, no guesswork. So he spent the next week cross-checking every transaction, every HOA expense. And with each page he turned, he felt the same familiar determination he used to feel before solving a case. By the end of the week, he had a full report ready. Names, documents, timestamps, and even testimonies from neighbors who had agreed to speak out. Karen had tried to push him out. Instead, she'd pushed him right into her secret. As Daniel closed his folder that night, a small smile crossed his face. He'd spent years chasing criminals who thought they were untouchable. They'd always made the same mistake. They underestimated the quiet ones, and Karen had just made that same mistake. The days grew warmer, and the small town began to show signs of summer. Lawns were green again. Kids rode bikes down the sidewalks, and families gathered in driveways to talk about weekend plans. But for Daniel, the season brought no rest. His house still hadn't sold, and the tension with Karen had only grown stronger. She didn't speak to him anymore, but he could tell she was keeping watch. Her car often slowed as it passed his house, and sometimes she'd stop by the corner mailbox just long enough to glance his way. Daniel didn't react. He'd learned long ago that silence could say more than anger ever could. But behind that calm face, his mind was working, piecing together the last bits of a puzzle that had taken over his life. He now had months' worth of evidence, dozens of letters, property records, and transaction histories, each one pointing to the same thing. Karen had been using her position as HOA president to scare homeowners into selling, then funneling those properties into her family's real estate business. But Daniel knew better than to jump the gun. The moment he confronted her without everything airtight, she'd twist the story. She'd play the victim, maybe even turn the neighborhood against him. No, he had to do this the right way. That morning he sat at his desk typing up his report like he used to in the old days. His fingers moved slowly, but his thoughts were sharp. He laid out the timeline, how the letters started, how the buyers disappeared, how the sales connected to her company. He cross-referenced every name, every date. He had been careful not to let anyone know what he was doing, but lately a few neighbors had started noticing. One afternoon, while Daniel was watering his plants, his next-door neighbor, a quiet man named Kevin, walked over. "You've been busy lately," he said with a smile. Daniel chuckled. "You could say that." Kevin looked around, making sure no one was nearby. "Word's getting around that you're digging into the HOA." Daniel didn't deny it. "Something like that." Kevin hesitated before speaking again. "If you need statements, I've got some. Karen fined me last year for a so-called yard violation. I paid it just to avoid trouble, but it never felt right." "I'd appreciate that," Daniel said. "The more records I have, the better." Kevin nodded. "You know, a lot of us have been hoping someone would finally stand up to her. Maybe this time she won't get away with it." After Kevin left, Daniel felt something he hadn't in a while. Support. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was real. People were quietly rooting for him. He spent the next few days organizing everything. He scanned Kevin's documents along with letters from other residents who had started to trust him enough to share their stories. By the end of the week, his small folder had turned into a thick binder, filled with proof. He labeled it Oakfield HOA, Internal Review. The title made it sound official enough to raise eyebrows if someone saw it, but as his case grew stronger, so did Karen's attempts to block him. One morning, a county inspector knocked on his door, saying they'd received an anonymous complaint about unlicensed construction on his property. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Construction? You're welcome to look around," There's nothing here but a garden hose. The inspector did a quick walk around and left apologizing. Daniel thanked him politely, but inside he knew exactly who had made that call. Karen was getting nervous. That meant she could make mistakes, and mistakes were what Daniel was counting on. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the rooftops, Daniel took a slow walk to clear his head. He passed by several houses, noticing people wave more often now. It seemed the tide was starting to turn. When he reached the small park near the clubhouse, he stopped. Through the window of the meeting room, he could see Karen inside, talking with two of the HOA board members. Her expression was tight, her gestures sharp. Whatever they were discussing didn't look friendly. Daniel quietly walked closer until he was near enough to hear a few words through the open window. "He's digging into the records," one of the men said nervously. Karen snapped, "Then make sure he doesn't find anything." "I'll handle it," the man replied. "You can't keep this quiet forever. He's got neighbors backing him now." Karen's voice dropped lower, almost hissing. "I've handled worse. He's just an old man looking for attention." Daniel's lips tightened. He quietly stepped away, careful not to make a sound. He didn't need to hear more. He'd heard enough. When he returned home, he sat for a long time staring at the folder on his desk. He'd seen this kind of arrogance before, the kind that made people think they were untouchable. Karen thought he was just an old retiree with too much time on his hands. She didn't realize she was up against someone who'd spent his life seeing through lies. The next day, Daniel decided to take things up a level. He contacted an old friend, Thomas, who still worked in the local police department. They had served together years ago, and though they hadn't spoken in a while, Daniel knew he could trust him. When Thomas answered the call, his familiar laugh came through the line. "Well, if it isn't Daniel Brooks, I figured you'd be somewhere fishing by now, not chasing trouble." Daniel chuckled. "Guess old habits die hard. What's going on?" Thomas asked. Daniel explained everything, carefully, calmly, with every detail lined up like pieces on a board. He told him about the harassment, the false fines, the real estate deals. When he finished, there was silence on the other end. Finally, Thomas said, "That's serious. Do you have proof?" "Plenty," Daniel replied. "Enough to make her nervous. Bring it in," Thomas said. "Let's see what you've got. But be careful. If she suspects you're talking to law enforcement, she might try to cover her tracks." "I know," Daniel said. "That's why I'm not going to tell her anything yet." The next morning, Daniel drove downtown and met Thomas at a quiet cafe. He handed him a flash drive and a few printed reports. Thomas went through them slowly, his expression growing more focused with each page. "Daniel," he said finally, "this is solid. You've got financial inconsistencies, property manipulation, and what looks like clear conflict of interest. If we dig deeper, we might find even more." "That's what I was hoping to hear," Daniel said. Thomas leaned forward. "Let me assign an investigator to this quietly. We'll need to verify the transactions and trace the money. If it checks out, we'll move forward officially." Daniel nodded. "Just keep my name off the radar for now. I don't want her catching wind of this." "Understood," Thomas said. When Daniel got home later that afternoon, the street was quiet. Karen's car wasn't parked outside her house for once. It was the first time in weeks he hadn't seen it. He took the chance to relax, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee as the sky turned orange. For the first time in a while, he felt a small sense of peace. The wheels were finally turning. Over the next few days, life in the neighborhood felt lighter. A few residents even stopped by to chat. There were smiles again, small ones, but they mattered. Then one afternoon, Daniel received a call from Thomas. "We've looked into it," Thomas said. "Your instincts were dead on. She's been funneling HOA funds into a private account under her cousin's name. It matches the same name tied to those real estate deals." Daniel sat back in his chair. "So it's all connected. Every bit of it. We're gathering more documentation before taking action. Don't let her know we're onto her." "I won't," Daniel said. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Not from worry, just from the restless energy of knowing the end was in sight. He walked around his house quietly, glancing at the memories scattered through the rooms, the framed photos, the worn armchair, the old case file still stacked in a corner. He had promised himself he was done with investigations when he retired. But maybe some things find you even when you're not looking. A few days later, Karen showed up again. It was late afternoon, the air heavy and warm. She stood at his door, arms crossed, clipboard in hand. "I noticed your sign is still up," she said sharply. Despite repeated warnings, Daniel smiled slightly. "Yes, it's still there." "You're leaving me no choice," she said. "The board will have to take legal action." "Legal action?" Daniel asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. "That sounds serious." "It is," she said firmly. "You can't just ignore community regulations." He nodded thoughtfully. "Funny thing about regulations, they have to be legal themselves to be enforced." Her eyes narrowed. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," he said. "But I am wondering how those HOA maintenance fees ended up in your cousin's business account." Her face froze for a fraction of a second before she caught herself. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Daniel said softly. "And soon a few other people will too." She took a step back, her confidence cracking just a little. "You're making a mistake," she said quickly. "I've made plenty," he replied, "but this isn't one of them." Karen didn't answer. She turned and walked away, her steps faster than usual. Daniel watched her go, his expression calm. He knew that look. He'd seen it countless times before. The look of someone who finally realized the game was up. That night he called Thomas again. "She knows something's coming," Daniel said. Thomas replied, "That's fine. We're almost ready. Once we confirm the last set of transfers, we'll move forward." "Good," Daniel said. "I'll be here." He hung up and sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of the ceiling fan. For the first time since this all began, he felt the weight lifting. Karen had tried to ruin his peace, but in the end, her own greed had done her in. The next morning, Daniel woke early and stepped outside just as the sun broke over the horizon. The air felt different, lighter, cleaner. The neighborhood, quiet as always, seemed to be holding its breath. He took a sip of his coffee and looked at the "for sale" sign still standing proudly in his yard. One way or another, this was coming to an end soon. And when it did, not just for him but for every homeowner Karen had ever bullied, justice would finally find its way home. A week had passed since Daniel's last talk with Thomas. Every day after that seemed quieter than the one before. Karen's car hadn't been seen much, and the usual stream of HOA letters had completely stopped. The neighborhood felt uneasy, like everyone was waiting for something to happen but didn't know what it would be. Daniel went about his routine as usual, watering the garden, reading on the porch, and keeping his notes organized. But inside he was preparing. The investigation had reached its final stage. The police had all the proof they needed. It was just a matter of timing now. One evening, while he was cooking dinner, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Thomas. "We're ready. HOA meeting is this Thursday. Be there. Keep calm." Daniel stared at the message for a moment, then smiled. The timing was perfect. The next few days went by slowly. Karen started showing up again, walking around the neighborhood like she owned it. She even waved at a few people, trying to look friendly, but Daniel could tell she was nervous. Her smile was tight. Her eyes kept darting around like she was checking who might be watching her. On Wednesday afternoon, Daniel got a flyer slipped under his door, a reminder for the monthly HOA meeting. He looked at the printed page and laughed softly to himself. The meeting was the next day, and it would be one no one in Oakfield Drive would ever forget. That night, Daniel slept lightly. His mind wandered back to his days in the force, the long nights before big cases broke open, the quiet before the storm. This felt the same. By Thursday evening, the sun had begun to set, casting warm orange light over the quiet streets. Cars lined both sides of the road near the community clubhouse. It was busier than usual. Word had spread that something big was coming, though no one knew exactly what. Daniel walked there slowly, folder tucked neatly under his arm. Inside were copies of everything he'd gathered: financial reports, fake violations, and property transfers. He wasn't there to argue anymore. He was there to end it. When he stepped inside the clubhouse, the air felt thick. Karen was already at the front, dressed neatly in a navy blue suit, clipboard in hand, pretending to be calm. Her usual group of board members sat beside her, their smiles stiff and uneasy. Residents filled the rows of folding chairs, whispering quietly among themselves. When Daniel entered, several people turned to look at him. Some nodded slightly, encouragement in their eyes. Karen noticed him and gave a polite but cold smile. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice carrying through the room. "Glad you could join us." I trust you've resolved your issues? Daniel nodded lightly. Oh, I think everything's about to be resolved. Her eyes narrowed, but she quickly turned back to the crowd. Let's begin, she said. The meeting started the same as always. Budget updates, lawn maintenance discussions, neighborhood safety reminders. Karen spoke smoothly, controlling the pace just like every other meeting. But there was a nervous edge to her tone this time, a slight crack she couldn't quite hide. When she finally reached the section about violations and compliance, she paused. Before we continue, I'd like to address the ongoing issue with Mr. Brooks, she said, looking directly at him. Despite multiple notices, he has continued to ignore community regulations. The board has decided that further action will be required. Daniel stood up slowly, his folder still in hand. Before you do that, I think everyone here deserves to know something. Karen frowned. This isn't the time for personal remarks, Mr. Brooks. Daniel ignored her. For months I've received letters, fines, and threats from this HOA. At first I thought it was just overreach. But after looking into it, I realized there's a much bigger problem here. The room grew quiet. Every eye was on him. Karen laughed nervously. This is not appropriate. Daniel held up a document. These are property records from the last 3 years. Every house that's been fined heavily or blocked from selling was later purchased by a company called Oakfield Holdings. The owner of that company happens to share a last name with our HOA president. Whispers spread through the crowd. Karen's face went pale. That's not true, she snapped. Those are public sales, anyone can buy them. Sure, Daniel said calmly. But it's interesting that the money from the HOA maintenance fees ended up in your cousin's account. Here are the bank records to prove it. He handed copies of the papers to a few residents in the front row. They looked through them, their expressions changing from confusion to shock. Karen's voice trembled slightly. You have no right to access private information. I didn't, Daniel said. The county records did, and the police department verified every number. Karen froze. Police department? Just then the clubhouse door opened. 2 plainclothes officers walked in quietly, followed by Thomas. He nodded once at Daniel before speaking to the group. Good evening, everyone, Thomas said. I'm Detective Thomas Reynolds with the county police. We've been investigating complaints about misuse of HOA funds and fraudulent practices. We've confirmed that several transactions link HOA accounts directly to private real estate deals. The room erupted in murmurs. Some residents gasped, others whispered to one another. Karen stood completely still, her clipboard shaking in her hands. This is outrageous, she said, her voice cracking. This is a setup. He's trying to destroy my reputation. Thomas turned to her calmly. Ma'am, we have the documents, bank records, and testimonies from homeowners. We'll need you to come with us for further questioning. Karen stepped back, eyes darting around the room looking for support, but the faces staring back at her were not sympathetic anymore. People she'd once ordered around now looked at her with disappointment and anger. This is a misunderstanding, she said weakly. Everything I did was for the good of the community. Daniel met her eyes. No, it was for yourself. You used this neighborhood like a business. You scared good people into selling their homes so your company could profit. You forgot that communities are supposed to protect their own. Karen tried to speak, but no words came out. One of the officers gently took the clipboard from her hands, while the other began guiding her toward the exit. As they passed Daniel, she glared at him, but her eyes showed something else too. Fear. When the door closed behind them, the room fell into complete silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then slowly, people began to clap. It started with 1 or 2, then spread until the whole room was filled with applause. Daniel didn't smile or raise his hand. He simply nodded once, humbly. After the noise settled, Thomas walked over to him. You did good work here, he said quietly. You gave us everything we needed. I just didn't want to see anyone else get hurt, Daniel replied. As Thomas left with the officers, the remaining residents gathered around Daniel. Some thanked him, others apologized for not speaking up sooner. He could see the mix of guilt and relief in their faces. Linda, the woman who had warned him months ago, came forward. You really did it, she said softly. You stopped her. Daniel shook his head gently. No, we all did. It just took someone to start asking questions. The crowd slowly dispersed, still talking among themselves. The mood was lighter now. People laughing nervously, sharing stories, expressing relief that it was finally over. Daniel stayed behind for a few minutes, sitting quietly in one of the chairs. The meeting room, once filled with tension, now felt peaceful. The air seemed clearer, like the neighborhood itself was finally taking a deep breath. When he stepped outside, the night sky was filled with stars. He walked home slowly, the gravel crunching softly under his shoes. It was quiet again, honest quiet this time, not the kind that hides unease. As he reached his house, he looked at the for sale sign still standing on his lawn. For the first time in months, he could actually see it selling soon, not because he had to leave, but because it was time. He sat on his porch with a cup of tea, thinking back over everything that had happened. Karen had tried to ruin his peace, but in doing so, she'd uncovered something in him he thought he'd left behind. The drive to fight for what's right, even when no one else will. The next morning, a few neighbors stopped by to check on him. They brought pastries, coffee, and smiles. "We're forming a new HOA board," one of them said cheerfully. "We'd love your input, at least until your move." Daniel chuckled. "I think I've had enough HOA politics for one lifetime. But thank you." They laughed, and for the first time in a long while, the street felt like a community again. Later that week, Thomas called with an update. "Karen's facing several charges," he said. "Fraud, embezzlement, and falsifying records. Looks like she'll be in court soon." Daniel nodded quietly. "I figured as much." "She really didn't see it coming," Thomas added. "That's usually how it goes," Daniel said. "People like her never do." After hanging up, he looked around his living room. The boxes were packed now, neatly labeled. The house felt lighter, emptier, but peaceful. He'd done what he came to do. Sold the house, yes, but also made sure no one else in that neighborhood would go through what he did. That evening, as the sun began to set, he sat outside one last time. Kids played down the street, laughter echoing through the air. A couple walking their dog waved, and he waved back. For a moment, he let himself just sit in silence, breathing in the calm. It wasn't about winning or proving anything. It was about closure, about leaving something better than he found it. He picked up his old notepad, the one he'd used during his investigation. He flipped to the last page and wrote, "Case closed. Oakfield HOA Justice served quietly." He smiled, closed the notebook, and set it aside. Tomorrow, he would leave for his daughter's town, start fresh, maybe even take up that fishing hobby everyone kept telling him about. But tonight he simply enjoyed the peace he'd fought to bring back. The streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow across the neighborhood. The sign on his lawn swayed gently in the evening breeze. Daniel leaned back, eyes half closed, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. After all the noise, the fights and the lies, peace finally felt real again. And this time, he knew it would last. The next few weeks passed more quietly than Daniel had ever known since moving to Oakfield Drive. The tension that once hung in the air was gone. The neighborhood was different now. You could see it in the way people smiled when they passed each other, or how kids played freely on the sidewalks again without parents peeking nervously through curtains. It was as if a long shadow had finally lifted. Daniel spent most of his days finishing the last of the packing. Each box carried a memory. The photos on the walls, the old police mementos, the gardening tools that had been his small joy during retirement. He took his time with everything. He didn't rush. He wanted to leave right. Sometimes, as he packed, he caught himself pausing to look around. The house was quieter now, the echo of his footsteps louder. He had spent so many years here, building routines, finding peace after a career that was anything but peaceful. Yet somehow in these last months he had been pulled back into the world he thought he'd left behind. The world of lies, investigations, and truth. And strangely, he didn't regret it. One morning, while he was sealing up another box, there was a knock on the door. When he opened it, he saw Linda standing there, holding a small plant pot in her hands. "I thought this would look nice in your new place," and she said with a shy smile. Daniel looked down at the small plant, a bright green succulent in a clay pot. "Thank you, Linda. That's kind of you." "I just wanted to say thank you," she continued. "You stood up when the rest of us were scared to. If you hadn't, I don't think things would have ever changed here." He shook his head gently. "It wasn't just me. It took everyone waking up and speaking out. Communities are like that. They heal when people care again." She smiled and nodded, her eyes warm. "We're voting for a new HOA board next week. People are actually excited about it for once. Maybe it'll be a good start. I'm sure it will, Daniel said. Just remember what it's supposed to be. A group that helps people, not controls them. She nodded again and waved as she walked back down the driveway. Daniel placed the plant on the windowsill, where the sunlight touched it gently. It looked like a small symbol of new beginnings, and he liked that. Later that day, Thomas called. How's it looking? Thomas asked, his voice light. Pretty close, Daniel said. House is nearly packed. Sale's almost done. That's good to hear. You deserve the rest, Daniel chuckled softly. Not sure I remember what rest feels like anymore. Thomas laughed. Well, for what it's worth, Karen's case is moving fast. Her cousin's been questioned, and it looks like the whole operation's coming down. You might get a thank you letter from the county soon. I don't need that, Daniel said. I just wanted the truth out. I know, Thomas replied. That's what made it work. After the call, Daniel sat on the porch sipping tea and watching the street again. It was a warm afternoon, sunlight dancing on the roofs, the smell of freshly cut grass in the air. A few neighbors walked by and waved. Some stopped to talk briefly, just small things about gardening or the weather, but it felt nice. It felt real. For the first time, he felt like part of the place, even as he was preparing to leave it. That night, he went through one last box. Inside were old case files and notebooks from his years in the force. He flipped through one, the handwriting slightly faded but familiar. Notes, sketches, evidence lists. Every page a small story of someone else's fight for truth. He smiled softly. Guess I never really stopped being a detective, he murmured to himself. The next morning was bright and clear. Moving day. A small truck pulled into the driveway and two movers stepped out cheerful and ready to work. Daniel helped where he could, carrying smaller boxes and guiding them through the house. As the rooms emptied, he felt a strange mix of sadness and peace. Every corner held a piece of his life. The living room where he'd spent quiet evenings, the kitchen where he'd brewed countless cups of tea, the garden that had given him comfort. When everything was loaded, he stood by the open door for a while, just looking inside. The walls seemed to echo softly. It didn't feel like a goodbye, more like a chapter closing the way it should. Just as he locked the door for the last time, a few neighbors gathered outside. Linda was there along with Mr. and Mrs. Green from down the street, and even the young couple who'd moved in recently. They brought coffee and pastries, insisting he couldn't leave without one last chat. They stood together on the driveway, talking and laughing. Someone mentioned how quiet the neighborhood had become lately, and everyone agreed it felt like peace had finally returned. When it was time for Daniel to go, Linda stepped forward again. You're always welcome here, she said softly. If you ever visit, don't be a stranger, he smiled. I won't. You all take care of this place. It's worth it. Then he got into his car and pulled away slowly, waving one last time as the group stood watching. As he drove through the familiar streets, memories flashed by. The first day he moved in, the quiet evenings, the small battles that turned into something bigger than anyone expected. By the time he reached the highway, Oakfield Drive was just a blur in the rearview mirror, but it stayed with him. Hours later, he arrived at his daughter's town. She greeted him warmly, helping him unload some of the boxes. The house she'd found for him was small but cozy, with a porch that faced a lake. Birds chirped nearby, and the sound of the water was calm and steady. That evening they had dinner together. She asked about everything, the investigation, the neighbors, the outcome. Daniel told the story in pieces, leaving out the heavy parts but keeping the lessons. I guess some people just don't know when to stop, she said after listening quietly. They forget what matters, he replied. Power makes people feel important even when it's over something small. But in the end, truth always catches up. His daughter smiled. You sound like you're back on duty, he laughed. Maybe I never really left it. Later that night, when everyone had gone to bed, Daniel sat outside on the porch watching the moonlight shimmer across the lake. The air was cool and the silence was deep, the kind of quiet he used to crave. He thought about everything that had happened, the anger, the lies, the confrontation, and finally, the calm after it all. It struck him how strange life could be. You could retire, move somewhere peaceful, and still find yourself in the middle of a case you never asked for. But maybe that was how life worked. You didn't choose every story you were part of. Sometimes the story chose you. As the night deepened, he took out his old notepad one last time. the same one he'd used during the HOA mess. He turned to a fresh page and wrote slowly, "When peace is disturbed, truth becomes duty, even in retirement." He underlined it once, then closed the notebook. The next morning, he woke early. The sky was pink and golden, and mist hovered gently over the lake. He brewed coffee and stepped outside again, feeling the cool air on his face as he sipped.